Fairies, a folkloric creature we all have some tangential relationship with, whether that is in the media we consume or our own explorations into the Fae. These anthropomorphic, preternatural creatures are found all over the globe and have origins deep into our prehistory. They are often perceived as guardians of nature and guides to the surreal Fae realm, a land where bizarre royalty live in immortal glee. Their immediate wholesome appearance of a tiny winged woman frolicking at the water's edge hides a more terrifying secret though, because these creatures are in fact more sadistic and conniving than any other folkloric creature we have yet investigated. Of course, a werewolf or zombie would happily rend you limb from limb, devouring your flesh in gleeful mouthfuls, but a fairy's goal is much more cruel, to flitter around you in cherubic innocence until your wits are dulled and you find yourself in a world you yourself struggle to comprehend. When you're finally allowed to return to the mortal realm, you find everything you've ever loved is long dead and buried. There is no apology from this preternatural creature, just the childlike giggles from an entity so ancient itself can't comprehend the pain it has caused you. A scientific explanation as to how these creatures came into being could be ancient folk memory of more advanced cultures interacting with hunter-gatherer tribes, for instance, the Celtic people having contact with the indigenous people of Great Britain. The tradition that cold iron could be used to ward away fairies could be a reference to those tribes that had discovered metallurgy, being able to outmatch those that only used flint and stone for their weapons.
A manifestation of this could be Stone Age flint arrowheads called elf-shot in folklore, which were considered the weaponry of fairies. In Newfoundland and Celtic folklore, bread is considered to ward off fairies, as it is a manifestation of the taming of nature, specifically transforming the plant wheat into digestible food.
To understand the origin of the fairy, we must go back to the earliest days of human civilization. The word fairy derives from the early modern English fairy, meaning realm of the fays, which in turn derives from fae, or fata in colloquial Latin, meaning the fates. These fates, or parse, were female personifications of destiny, who controlled the metaphorical threads of life for mortals in ancient Roman myth. The concept of supernatural beings can be traced back to ancient cultures all over the world. They weren't tiny winged creatures though, but rather powerful spirits and deities connected to nature. There are no specific recorded textual references as to where the fairy came from, but historians believe that convergent mythology from Germanic, Celtic and Persian cultures birthed it into ours.
The Peris are mentioned in Persian texts as far back as 550 BCE and are described as fair, beautiful nature spirits with wings. As early Eurasian settlers migrated around the vast continent, their own Proto-Indo-European mythology would have been altered by foreign influences, and the idea of anthropomorphic, ethereal winged beauties frequenting this earth would have been incepted. As this culture spread further across Europe, and humans began a more sedentary farming existence as opposed to a migratory hunter-gatherer lifestyle, these folk tales would have been used to explain incomprehensible events, like disappearances or surreal natural occurrences. Similar concepts existed in ancient Greece and Rome, where nymphs, dryads, and other nature spirits played roles in mythology. These creatures always tended to be associated with the wilderness, or structures like henges or burial mounds, whose true purpose had been lost after eons of time. In Celtic mythology, for example, the Aosai were believed to be a race of godlike beings who lived in Sydney, or the earthen mounds and ancient tumuluses that are scattered around the British and Irish landscape. These beings, whilst originally being described as how we imagine a Tolkien-esque fantasy elf to look like, later evolved into the fairies of Irish folklore. They were known for their connection to the natural world and their ability to influence human life, but it wasn't just the Celts who had these beliefs. In other parts of Europe, such as Scandinavia, belief in fairies took the form of elves, who were connected to nature and had a significant place in the mythology of the region. These beings were often associated with the wilderness and were thought to possess great beauty and power.
Fairies have always been an integral part of folklore, especially in rural communities where belief in the supernatural was strong. In these traditions, fairies were seen as guardians of the land and spirits of the dead. They were highly respected, and people would go out of their way to leave them offerings or to avoid actions that they might find insulting. Similarly to superstitions about other mythical figures, such as speak of the devil and he may appear, fairies were often spoke about euphemistically, instead being referred to as the unworthy dead, the children of Eve, and wee folk. Belief into the existence of these creatures has survived well past the medieval and Renaissance age, deep into the Victorian and Edwardian periods. It's still alive today, with renewed interest in paganism and Celtic and indigenous European practices. To learn more about the fairy, I've collaborated with Siân, who's a folklorist and also host of the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. But before we jump over to that, I'd just like to say, if you are enjoying the video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy history, fantasy, folklore and storytelling, please make sure to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more of that to come in the future. Thank you so much. Hello and welcome, Siân, from the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really, really excited to have this conversation. The first question I kind of had in mind was, in my research, I found that fairies are quite ambiguously described, almost from generation to generation, depending on certain cultures and whatnot. In your experience, how have they been described?
This is always one of my favourite questions as it relates to any sort of folkloric creature.
Yeah.
Because there is usually very, very little consistency when it comes to like visual descriptions of folkloric creatures. Like you kind of know what they look like.
Yeah.
Some folklorists and storytellers are a little bit clearer than others.
Yeah.
You know, they'll give you the actual 3 foot tall. So you've
Yes.
got a very clear picture of what they're supposed to look like. But then, of course, some will be completely different. It will be, you know, a 5-inch winged creature. One of my favourite examples of this, actually, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I promise I'll make my way back.
No, it's quite all right. Tangent away.
Is actually describing giants.
Yeah.
And it's hilarious to me how there's no consistency with the height of giants.
Okay.
So, for example, we're in Cornwall and we have so many giants, one of whom is the big giant that Jack the Giant Slayer first killed. And that giant is 18 foot tall. So, yeah, he's tall. You don't want to get into a fight with an 18 foot tall, very angry chap.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas another giant, Bolster Giant, is 3 miles tall.
Wow.
And it's the same with Cornish piskies. It's the same with fairies as a whole. And I often say about folklore, I find it a very useful tool to understand human beings. You know, we've got archaeology, we've got literature, we've got these kind of traditional forms of that historians take. But I find folklore to be a really great tool to understand people and their beliefs.
Yeah.
So what I love is that the same types of creatures pop up around the world, and fairies do, you know, fairy types of creatures. So yeah, almost every culture of the world has a fairy-like creature, you know, with its own name in their kind of native languages, but they have a fairy type creature. And what muddies the waters even more is that, some of these are 3 foot tall, kind of in the garbs of humans and doing a very human task. So, for example, some of the piskies in Cornwall, you've got the knockers, which were the piskies that lived down in the mines. They are usually described as being about 2-3 foot tall. They're wearing mining garb, they're carrying little lanterns, little pickaxes. So you've got that description. And then you've got the very classic Victorian fairy, which is a very small, winged creature, you know, quite adorable.
Or angelic, isn't it?
Angelic, you know, Tinkerbell in Peter Pan, which is kind of the classic example. So, the descriptions of fairies vary quite wildly from culture to culture because, of course, you have some fairies which are human-sized. They're simply the kind of the inhabitants of the other world. And you find that a lot in Welsh and Irish, Scottish, Scandinavian, you know, Icelandic folklore, this idea of this race of people who kind of live in a world that overlaps our own. And in many of the depictions, they are human-sized. The description of them is very different depending on the story, where that story comes from. There is no there's no uniform fairy.
Exactly, yeah, thank you. They're created in the context of the humans that know them. It would make sense that if a fairy lived in a mine, they would be very similar to what a Cornish miner would look like in that sense.
Different cultures around the world, dependent on what the people look like, dependent on the weather patterns of that area, dependent on the geography of that area, the geology of that area even, dependent on all of these different factors will mean that the folklore itself can be quite individualized to those places and different in many ways, but a lot of the core elements are essentially the same, which is, it's really fascinating. I wonder if people often told stories to be able to kind of understand the people of the past. And in terms of the stories that existed as contemporary stories, there's lots of different functions for those types of folk tales, whether or not they are safety stories. I'm going to tell a bedtime story to my children about this monster that lives in the lake. Yeah. Really, it's a story about don't go playing right next to a deep body of water. It's a cautionary tale. And then some things are meant to bring comfort in a way. So I previously mentioned the Cornish knocker. Well, that's quite comforting to a miner who works in a very dangerous environment. Folklore says that miners would leave the crust of their pasty for the knockers. Yeah. And in turn, the knockers knock. They're named for knocking. So one of their knocks was to lead you to the best ore veins, and one of their knocks to alert you to the fact that the mine was about to collapse in on itself or something like that.
I find that really, really fascinating because obviously if a mine were to collapse, there would be noises beforehand.
So it would be creaking.
And of course, being in that environment, a pitch black environment with just a tiny little candle flickering, if you did hear noises off in the distance, I think it's a lot more comforting to imagine a little creature that was actively looking out for you.
It was on your side.
And you had a relationship with, rather than some hell beast. It was the alternative,
some monster
isn't it?
of the deep.
Yeah,
I've always loved that as part of the knocker folklore, that there is this mutual relationship between kind of man and between the creature in the folklore. There is that interesting quality to some folklore that, some of it's meant to frighten children into acting safely. Some of it's meant to entertain, and I think some of it is meant to comfort. And I wonder how much some of it is also to contextualize the world around us and to make sense of the world around us.
I have a saying which is, I believe magic lives in the space between the unexplainable and the apparent. It's been used to explain away or, give a very, very strong message. The brilliant thing with that is kind of symbiotic relationship we have, arguably just with nature, but we kind of anthropomorphize it. It's almost like if there's an anthropomorphic creature that is kind of the guardian, or almost like the step between nature and ourselves.
Well, I think we love to anthropomorphize everything, don't we?
So it's always going to be about us.
Yeah, it's always going to be about us. But, I love authors like Terry Pratchett who does that so perfectly. Yeah. All these big elements of humanity, like death, creates it into an actual character. Yeah. All of these stories are informed by the people that tell them, and people are informed by the landscape that we live in.
So interesting you mention that, because very close to where I am at the moment, there's this incredible woodland. Having done a little bit of research about it, it's a Celtic rainforest, specifically on the west coast of most of the UK. There's mosses and ferns and lichens and the kind of thing you don't see in the rest of the UK, and it does feel rather otherworldly. Like you said, humans need a way to explain away those fantastic phenomenon. So another question I had for you was, how do you think fairy folklore has evolved through the ages?
I think, like all folklore, is constantly evolving. I think one of the worst things that we can do in terms of bits of culture, of which folklore very much is one, and storytelling, is you fossilise it. You pretend it's something of the past, you know. Folklore is something that is constantly evolving because we're still telling stories.
Yes.
And I think we'll always tell stories. Now, the form of these stories has changed. Now you've got a lot of urban fantasy. Yeah. Much of that is influenced by folklore. So I think even that is a way of different storytelling evolving.
We're still telling human stories,
We're
aren't
still
we?
telling human stories and non-human stories.
Yes.
But in terms of fairy, it's interesting to me because if you look at a lot of the classic fairies, you've got the Tuatha Danann in Ireland, you've got the Sidhe, you've got the Seelie and the Unseelie court in Scottish folklore. In terms of their description, they can look very human, but in terms of their temperament, they're very capricious. They can be very helpful and they can be very not. Cornwall, we've got this term called piskie led, and that's when you get very, very lost. And the idea behind that is that the piskies have led you astray. They've led you in circles. You've completely lost your bearings. So you have the kind of nearly harmless thing of losing your bearings.
Yeah.
And then you can take that all the way to, you know, this is an evil, cannibalistic creature that dips its hat into the blood of its enemies.
Yes,
And
yes. Is that a red nap? Is that
yes, on the Scottish borders.
Yeah.
There's this idea in the past of fairy type creatures. Like nature itself is very wild and capricious. So these creatures can help you on the farm, they can warn you when a mine's collapsing in on itself, or they can be very violent, they can lead you astray. Those stories became quite sanitized for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, you had the sort of classic Victorian English fairy, rosy cheeked, very much like Tinkerbell and Peter Pan. I wonder if part of that was also sanitizing and homogenizing kind of regional bits of folklore.
From the research I've done, during the Victorian era, which is obviously so prominent for industrialization, it was at that point, you could argue, where we had mastered nature in one form or another, and we were spilling out, polluting and whatnot or other, and all of a sudden the fairy became rather unintimidating and rather angelic.
And I think now people are really interested in the bloodthirsty fairies.
Definitely.
They're really interested in this idea of these really wild, dark natural forces that you can perhaps make deals with, you can seek favour from, you can request a boon from. So it's really interesting that in some ways, this new version of folk tales, in many ways, it's drawing from elements of the past, and in some ways, it's adding completely new and modern qualities.
In an era of ours, I think having a little bit of mysticism and a little bit of fantasy, I think that's what people truly crave really at the moment. It got to that point now where, you know, we've got so much over atheism that maybe making a deal with the Fae is actually something that's quite tantalising and seductive and interesting.
Over commercialisation, deaths of communities, stuff like this, I feel like there's a gap for many of us, and we're kind of trying to fill that with something. I find now you have a whole load of people who are again at the point where they really do believe in the creatures in these stories. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it's getting to a really interesting point now where religion, religious practice, folklore, history, where they're all kind of melding together in really interesting ways.
Would you believe it? History and anthropology and culture in general is a lot more complex and a lot more diverse than we could ever really comprehend at first. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me about fairies, and I think about everything else in between as well. The one thing I want to do on this channel is talk a little bit more about our own relationship with nature and ourselves and things like that, because like I said, that's what folklore is all about. So thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for agreeing to have this little conversation with me. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for asking me.
No, it's quite all right. Is there anything you particularly want to plug before we sign off?
I think I would just like to say to people, if you are interested in myths and legends and folklore and stuff like that, I do have a podcast. It's the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. And would you believe that it's about Celtic myths and legends?
Fantastic.
So anyone that's interested in any of the sort of things that I've talked about here, please go and give that a listen.
With fairies having a mystical association with nature, it only makes sense that their own realm is a heightened version of our own wilderness.
In Irish folklore, this place is called Tir Nag Og, or Land of the Young. In Scottish and English folklore, fairies and fays were believed to reside in a parallel world called the Fairy Realm, or Fairyland, and in Celtic folklore, the Other World. This place is described as being eerily similar to our own world, but with a heightened sense of surrealism, with beautiful grass meadows and forested wilderness. This place has an abundance of nature, as industrialisation had never taken place and was against the very nature of its inhabitants. Time passes differently in the fairy realm, or the inhabitants of it are near immortal. Siân, the protagonist of an old Irish folktale, discovered that 300 years had passed once he returned to the mortal realm. By this time, the Fennin, or fair folk, fairies that inhabited the mortal world, had long disappeared and become old wives' tales.
There are many different ways to travel to this land. Some say it is an island 3 days off the coast of Ireland into the Atlantic Ocean, while some say it is deep under the sea. Neolithic burial mounds are said to be a gateway or pickpocket to the other world, as well as areas of outstanding natural beauty, like this dell here, or the bottom of natural pools and streams like this. These gateways manifest because of an abundance of natural energy or fey magic, especially at dawn or dusk.
Or during the Esbaltaine, May Day, or Amhain harvest festivals.
In the medieval period, the idea of fairies began to evolve. In medieval Europe, they became more associated with folklore and superstition. Their tales were often cautionary, warning people about the dangers of the unknown.
During this time, fairies were often depicted as mischievous or malevolent beings. They could inflict death upon livestock, or even shoot people with an elf shot or blast. If one angered a fairy by deceiving it or destroying its sacred ground, they could lead you astray from a path to be lost in the forest. There is a folktale in Weardale, County Durham, UK, in which a little girl was lured by music into a fairy cave, then rescued by the help of an old woman and 3 mysterious magic objects. Fairies in this time were considered to kidnap babies and replace them with a changeling. Sometimes a changeling was described as a stock, a piece of wood made magically to resemble the kidnapped human, or the child of a fairy who had been swapped to live a better existence in the human world.
Monolithic sites, like the Minotaur here in Cornwall, were said to have many magical properties, as well as being a gateway to the Fey realm. Folktales tell us that if a changeling baby was passed through this stone, the fairy would be compelled to return the human infant back to its mother. Neolithic sites like this were once scattered all over the UK, but were destroyed because of their association with witchcraft.
Because these creatures controlled the unexplainable, they were worshipped in pagan beliefs, where people would give them offerings for wishes, such as safe travel. This probably influenced the Christian tenet, which described fairies as angels who had rebelled against God, and when the gates of heaven were shut, were stuck between heaven and hell. This is because an offering, or tithe, could be used to compel the subject of Satan to do one's bidding. As indigenous pagan beliefs became more abstracted in 17th century England with the rise of Puritanism, convening with fairies was perceived as witchcraft and punishable by death. Confusingly, during the medieval period, the word fairy began to be used objectively, describing magical acts such as illusions and enchantments, creatures like goblins, gnomes, sprites, will-o'-the-wisps, and later in the Elizabethan era, elves. The word fairy has become so synonymous with folklore, magic, and mythical beings that a whole genre, the fairy tale, is used to describe such stories, despite the creatures often not featuring in them. The Renaissance saw a shift in how fairies were portrayed. Influenced by classical literature and the humanist movement, fairies began to be seen in a more positive light. William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream is a perfect example of this, where fairies like Oberon, Titania, and Puck were portrayed as powerful and magical beings, embodying the enchantments of the natural world.
The 19th century saw a shift in how the fairy was perceived. In the Victorian era, there was renewed interest in them, but now being viewed as angelic and whimsical.
The Industrial Revolution and rapid changes in society led people to yearn for a simpler, more magical past, and fairies became symbols of this lost world. Victorian art and literature were filled with images of delicate, winged fairies, often depicted in beautiful gardens or woodland settings. This period also saw the rise of spiritualism, which further fueled interest in the supernatural, including fairies. Fairy tales were popularised, and authors like J.M. Barrie and his famous character Tinkerbell brought fairies into the modern imagination in 1904. A hysteria about the existence of fairies erupted in 1919 with the Cottingley fairy hoax. This was instigated by 2 young cousins who in 1917 told a white lie to one of their mothers about fairies inhabiting a beck at the bottom of the garden after being scolded for playing in the water. They then borrowed a camera from one of their fathers and took a collection of photographs with themselves and the supposed fairies. The father dismissed the photos as cardboard cutout hoaxes immediately, but one of the children's mothers brought the images along with them when they attended a talk on fairy life at the Theosophical Society in Bradford. The photos were later taken to the annual conference in Harrogate, UK, and eventually were used by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to illustrate an article he wrote on the topic. Conan Doyle's obsession with the supernatural, and fairies specifically, continued, as he wrote The Coming of the Fairies, published in 1922, where he compiled evidence for the existence of such creatures. Today, fairies continue to enchant and inspire, but their portrayal has evolved even further. In modern pop culture, fairies have become more diverse, appearing in everything from fantasy novels and films to video games and television shows. They are often depicted as powerful, independent beings, sometimes aligned with nature, other times within magical realms. Fairies in modern media can range from the benevolent, like the fairy godmother in Cinderella, to the dark and mysterious, as seen in films like Pan's Labyrinth. This reflects our continuing relationship with these creatures, as well as our desire to explore the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds. Ultimately, the history of fairies is as rich and as varied as the cultures that created them. From ancient spirits of nature to the whimsical beings of modern stories, fairies have captured our imaginations for centuries. They represent the mysteries of the natural world, the unseen forces that influence our lives, and the endless possibilities of the human imagination. Whether you believe in them or not, fairies continue to be a powerful symbol in our collective consciousnesses, reminding us of the magic that exists in this world around us and within ourselves.
Thank you for coming with me on this journey where we investigated this magical and mythical creature. If you've enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more, make sure to subscribe and also comment which magical creature I should investigate next. If you can't wait that long though, this playlist here should give you all the information you need. Thank you so much again.